Hello everyone, to everyone that's filing in now for our final session of the day of Evidence for Action, Aligning the Climate and SDG Agendas. Welcome. Just while people are logging in, I'll just go over the usual. Use your full name and affiliation so we know where you're from. Any questions, please submit them to the chat box. I'm sure this is going to be a lively ending discussion, so please do put your questions in there, and remain on mute as usual to avoid any disruption. And in case you're wondering if you're in the right session, you are. It's the final plenary. We're looking back from 2030, the 15-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Development Agenda. Did they compete or did they align? So from here on, I will pass you on to our chair, John Thompson.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Amy. And welcome all. It's my pleasure to be chairing this final session of our three-day symposium. It's been quite an exhaustive but exciting 3 days. And we've covered a lot of territory. We've reflected on a lot of different topics and had a multiplicity of speakers from many countries. We'll hear more about that at the very end here. But this session is slightly different in structure and focus from our plenary and parallel sessions that we've had over these days. It's more of a thought experiment. And we've brought together 4 thought leaders, people who have tremendous expertise and understanding of complex global environmental and developmental challenges from a range of different perspectives. And what we've done is we've asked them to take us kind of back to the future, to think where they might, what things might look like if they were standing in the year 2030, and they'd put on their Doc Brown type of helmets to imagine this past 10 years, and then look both backwards to 2021, where we're standing today, what's happened, what's worked, what hasn't, and why, and also then come back to the present and look towards the future to think about what things have changed, what's worked from that perspective, and where might we go from here. So our panel, our esteemed panel, includes Vinita Damodaran from the University of Sussex. I'll ask each person to introduce themselves. Valerie Kapos from WCMC, from the World Conservation Monitoring Center. Francisco Estrada from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and Ravi Prabhu from the World Agroforestry Center. Vinita, maybe you want to say a few words about your background and focus.
Thank you, John. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I am a professor of South Asian history at the University of Sussex. I've run the Center for World Environmental History since 2002. I'm a historian of India's Aboriginal communities, and I work very closely on mining-related issues and landscapes of tribal communities.
Thank you. Val?
Now that I've mastered the unmute button. Hello, everyone. My name is Valerie Kapos. I lead the Climate Change and Biodiversity team at the UN Environment Programme's World Conservation Monitoring Center, which is UNEP-WCMC to its friends. We're in Cambridge in the UK. My background is actually that I'm a tropical forest ecologist, and I spent quite a lot of my early career tramping around in the Amazon, getting very wet and muddy. But for the last far more years than I'd like to count, I've been working on climate change and biodiversity issues and looking at where they converge, conflict, and how efforts to address them are complementary or not.
Thank you. Francisco.
Hey everybody. Thanks. I'm Francisco Estrada. I'm a researcher at the Center for Atmospheric Sciences at UNAM, at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. I'm also the head of the Climate Change Research Program at UNAM, and I'm a visiting fellow of the VU University in Amsterdam. What I do is climate change in general. I'm supposed to be an economist, but I have been working with so many people in so many different topics that I do not consider myself an economist anymore. Something weird. And well, I think that's about it.
Thank you. Ravi.
Yeah, thanks, John. As the name suggests, Ravi, Prabhu. I work for the Center for International Forestry Research, World Agroforestry Center, which is now a merger of two institutions. I'm a forester by training. I was trying to think, how I'd describe myself. I think the best description for me is global gypsy, both in terms of, where I've been and in terms of my intellectual journey. So trained as a forester, but, I find that more and more what I'm trained to do is look at computer screens and figure out what people are saying on them. My role is to try and think a little bit outside our conventional boxes, and so I have a remit now to push innovation at our center and try and link evidence to action. So I guess for what it's worth, that's what I do.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you all. Just to get us moving on this panel, we were asking people to think about the aligning and accelerating of action around the climate and SDG agendas. And we were asking our panelists to think about that. Obviously, we can be optimists, we can be pessimists, we can think about the glass being half empty or half full. In a variety of ways, and we can do that by just having our own personal opinions. But what we're asking this panel to bring is that expert opinion based on their years of expertise, their research, their understanding of these issues from a range of technical perspectives, but also recognizing the power and politics that drive development policies, practices, pathways in a variety of directions. And we know this year, in particular, this has been described, in fact, on yesterday in our one of our plenary sessions as a super year to 2021. It's the kickoff of the decade of action for the UN. There are a whole set of major summits and major events taking place. We know here in the UK, COP26 on climate. There is also supposed to be the Biodiversity Conference, COP15 this year. That looks like it's being moved into 2022. There are a couple of major summits on energy, food systems, and so on. It's also the launch of a set of decades around ecosystem restoration, around ocean science, around healthy aging, interestingly, and even on road safety. So there's a lot happening in this year to take us moving into the future. But of course, we've also had the shock of COVID, which has disrupted some of these plans, which is one of the reasons why the COP15 for the conference, the Convention on Biodiversity has been moved into next year. And it's also disrupted a lot of the ambitious plans that we've had in place for this addressing these twin challenges of climate and the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're now talking about 10 years to transform our world, this decade of action, thinking about global action, local action, people action, as the UN describes it. The clock is ticking here. And we've asked our colleagues to stand in 2030, imagining that they're there 10 years from now, nearly, and looking back over this period to think about, well, have we realized these ambitious goals to align, to accelerate, to achieve the Paris Agreement, the SDG agendas, a whole set of related initiatives that we've put in place or about to kick off in this super year of 2021. And if I could invite Vinita to start us off, given your role as a historian, an environmental historian, and looking at that big picture of long-term change. Maybe you can get us started.
Thank you very much, John. Historians rarely peer into the future. We are trained to look at the past. Exactly. And even drawing lessons from the past is seen as teleological for us. But I will try and do that for you because in my role as an environmental historian, I've been asked to comment on several panels, including more recently the Lancet, which wants me to talk about planetary health. So in some senses, being a historian today is particularly advantageous. As an environmental historian, I've been interested in understanding turning points in history. So this urban, you could look back 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, urban development marks one major turning point, creating a threshold for the creation of, say, new resource demands and markets. And you can talk about the Sumerian Empire and so on. More recently, from the Western Industrial Revolution, 1800, is seen as another major turning point where we've been tapping into the potential for fossil fuel use and so on. And coming more recently to 1991, the post neoliberal sort of period has been another turning point, one could argue. And I would also like to introduce the whole concept of ecological and climate tipping points. So turning points and tipping points, which of course scientists have defined as various both local and global tipping points, and the context of the anthropogenically introduced sort of climate change debates, we are talking both about global tipping points. But as a historian of India's Aboriginal communities, I've been particularly concerned with local tipping points. And I've had, once again, very interesting datings for that, which go back, say, to the late 19th century in the case of Eastern India. So from the vantage point of, say, 2030, looking back, I would see that this period marks another in terms of our planetary health, dramatically affecting our global food production systems, the quality of the air we breathe, the water we drink, our exposure to infectious diseases, COVID-19 being a case in point, but also looking at zoonotic episodes in history, crossing the animal-human barrier, the way in which diseases have been transmitted, and the potential for this, and in many ways, the habitability of the places we live in. Changes to natural life support systems are already impacting our health and are projected to drive the majority of the global burden of disease over the coming century, hitting both the most vulnerable and future generations the hardest. And I think post-COVID, the scenario has dramatically changed in this context. So looking back as a historian, and given the sort of history of sustainability, which I have studied in some detail from the moment of the Kyoto Agreement, which actually took some responsibility for these the more recent turning points in history in terms of historical responsibility of colonial countries to the Paris Agreement, where there's been very little responsibility. It seems to be everyone is in it together sort of argument, which clearly we are not. So looking back as a historian, I would be pessimistic whether we can hold the juggernaut that we've been put in motion since 1800, or the impact of top-down initiatives. And once again, the example here of the British Empire comes to mind, colonial empires, which put into place some of the most draconian legislation in India under the British Empire. 1/6 of the landscape was sterilized into forest reserves. I mean, this is sort of unheard of. And they did this because they were very worried about the long-term security of the colonial state in terms of desiccation and water use. So these were very top-down instrumentalist measures, which one historian, Richard Grove, has called green imperialism. So are we, in some senses, looking back, thinking of these sort of solutions? So also as a historian of India's tribal communities, and these communities sit on one of the most important bauxite reserves that are being mined as we speak for the industrial and military complex of the West, the relentless sort of capitalist ethic in the region, chasing raw materials and other means of production from non-capitalist strata and societies, turning these tribal communities into coolies. In some ways, this appropriation of productive forces for purposes of exploitation, ransacking the whole world, procuring means of production from all corners of the earth, seizing them. In some senses, the Eastern Indian frontier being part of a sort of Klondike mining rush. So looking back then from 2030, are we going to be able to change this trajectory? And whether we have grabbed the significance of the moment that we are in now and seizing it, I'm slightly pessimistic. Everyone today, from the top scientists to policymakers, are grappling to understand the magnitude of what this means to us as a society, especially in the context of COVID, to understand what risk and resilience means in new and different ways. The solutions, I hasten to add, cannot be top-down or technocratic. It has to come from communities, localities, democratic bottom-up solutions found in places like Eastern India, where threatened groups ask development for whom, as they challenge multinational mining companies polluting their water and their air.
I'm gonna hold you there because we're going to come back to some of these solutions when we start looking forward.
Yeah. So in some senses, looking back, my feeling that you are still going to get the rehearsal of the old top-down measures that we've had historically is what I'm thinking about is where we move from here in terms of a more democratic-based sort of solution or people's sort of solution.
Thank you very much. Val.
Well, I think what I think looking back from 2030 depends on which day I look back, or at least which day now I look back from 2030. I do think we will have made progress. I don't think we will have achieved most of these objectives we've set for ourselves. I think we will have made progress towards them. So I think we'll be on track for roughly a 3 degree or 3 and a bit degree global climate change. We'll be seeing some aspects of greater equity and greater resilience that come from people actually taking climate change more seriously. And I think we're already seeing that now. People are beginning to recognize the risks to the very vulnerable and to recognize that some of the very vulnerable are not the people they thought they were or the assets they thought they were. So I think we will see improvements, but we will have lost a heck of a lot more nature, despite having ambitious goals for nature. And because of who I am and what I do, I always think about the climate and the nature agendas put together. So we may well have achieved some response targets in the nature world. We're fairly likely to achieve some of those protection targets. But the question is whether they can by themselves deliver what else we need. Because the pressures that we're dealing with, both for climate change and for nature conservation, are much more complicated than those that can be met by simple quantitative targets about areas that are somehow protected. It very much depends on the approaches that we take, the engagement of a range of stakeholders, professionals, as Vinita said, communities and grassroots actors, to essentially buy in is the wrong word, but to maybe perhaps embrace the challenges that we're facing, to understand them and to develop their own solutions. So I think we will actually have made some progress that we don't anticipate at the moment, because we're beginning already to see quite a lot of innovation. We're seeing a growth in both the supply and the use of renewable energy, which should help. But is it going to be big enough? I doubt it. And is the way we manage land going to contribute enough? No, I think it will help. And I think we'll be doing some things better than we are now. And when you come back to me, I'll tell you something about how I think those things might happen. I don't know if that was 3 minutes, but I'm going to stop.
That's fine. Thank you very much. Francisco.
Yeah, well, a little disclaimer. We economists are very famous for getting the future wrong. So that being said, well, looking back from 2030, we are still very far from reaching the Paris Agreement goals. Global temperature is really close to 1.5 already, increase. Progress has been made, but we had some after COVID. Many countries tried to recover as fast as they could using whatever they could, dirty energy, for example. So we have a lot of pollution. And even if technology is progressing really fast and we're moving towards a more clean world, this is not happening everywhere. No? We also have discovered, as we started noticing around 2021, that the climate system has started having these nonlinear responses to forcing, like what happened in Canada a few weeks ago and these kind of things, and all these flooding events that are happening. This is becoming much more common, and this is pushing people to act. But it's becoming evident that we have this deficit of adaptation in many regions of the world, particularly in the global south. COVID did leave a good lesson. No? We realized that modern societies are not shielded from nature for climate or wherever non-human risks. So people are moving towards developing more science locally. Like, for example, the fact that many countries didn't have access to vaccines, because they didn't develop the technology to produce them. That really rang a bell in many politicians' head. I hope so. And SDGs are far from being reached. There is progress being made, but the COVID-19, the outcome had like a permanent effect on many countries, like structural change. And we are still far from that. The COVID-19 brought us back, I don't know, 20 years back in reaching these goals. So I don't want to depress you anymore, so I will stop here.
Well, they call economics the dismal science, so that's part of it. If I could turn to Ravi.
Thanks, John. And I'm amazed that across the time span of 15 years, I can still hear you almost in real time. Well, it is a 2-degree world that we've reached, John. I'm sorry about that. I know you were hoping for a 1.5-degree world, but it's not going to happen. But a number of things did happen, and Francisco was talking about non-linearities. Just looking back, and the journey from 2015 to where I am today in 2030, both personal and professional, is summed up in the sense of peaks and troughs. 2015, I think for most of us, and 2016 was sort of the epitome of our professional careers. The SDGs had been, the Paris Climate Agreement had finally been agreed. It looked like history was a thing of the past. Sorry, Vinita. I mean, and there's books to that effect. And suddenly everything crashed, particularly when Donald Trump embodied the change. We've picked ourselves up, and 2021 started a year of change, but it wasn't necessarily a year of change driven by the people at the top. I think what happened, and my perspective is the perspective of the management of land and land resources, was that people were pushed to the brink and had to change. Let me take the context, what happened in Indian agriculture. The Green Revolution, a mixed blessing perhaps, but definitely a blessing to start off with, had reached the end of its tether. Across the Indo-Gangetic Plain and other areas of the Green Revolution breadbaskets, groundwater had dropped to 200 meters below surface, and what they were pumping up into the crops was arsenic. Farmers were indebted, an average farmer in a poor area with 500,000 rupees of indebtedness. Food was no longer nutritious, and local crops had been driven out of the household. And 80% of water was used by just 2 crops, rice and wheat. This had to change. Farmers took to the streets, and in many places, and one of the journeys that I've accompanied since then is the rise of natural farming. And the rejection of pesticides, fertilizers, and sound management of water. So what started as a trickle became a flood. Was this enough? No, it wasn't. It did slow change. Agriculture contributes massively to biodiversity depletion, as Val knows only too well, but also to climate change. But it slowed it down. Natural farming started showing that you could cut emissions by 30 to 40%. Across in the Sahel, the experiments that with policy and farmer empowerment resulted in farmer managed natural regeneration, regreening Niger, 500,000 hectares. And that example started being picked up right across the Sahel, where farmers were then empowered to look at trees as the adaptation keystones, life forms par excellence, so that you started growing crops under trees rather than removing the trees to grow crops. Across Latin America and from Latin America, the agroecology movement moved from politics into science. And then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden the world realized we cannot do without science, we cannot do without evidence. And scientists from being relegated to the back rows were brought back to talk about their results. All of this started movements more from the bottom pushing up than from all the negotiations which had stood still for ages, because the disconnect between governance and those in governance and the people they were governing had become vast, and the distrust of power and politicians incredible. So what changed, John, from 2021, 2022 onwards was movements from the bottom, and people empowering themselves, locally started actions and networking across groups and across countries, across languages, so that what we then started seeing was a change in land stewardship. No longer was agriculture just about food. It was about the management of ecosystem services, and rewards for ecosystem service management started being realized beyond payments for ecosystem services. So what happened was a paradigm change, a change that I like to think about as a stewardship economy, a duty of care economy emerging across the world, quite spontaneously in many places. And we are still looking to see how that practice leads policy as I stand here in 2030 with the hope of net zero, perhaps in the next 5 to 10 years. But I don't know what our friends on the industrial side are going to do, because I understand the next batch of billionaires is all off on their jaunt once more, this time to the moon.
Okay, thank you. You've kind of started to explore these questions of some of the critical factors that either brought about some coordinated and transformative action, perhaps in some cases, but also all of you have highlighted some of the obstacles, some of the constraints that limited that action, that limited that transformation. Maybe you can elaborate just briefly on what you think are some of the positive factors that have supported some of that alignment and action, and also some of the major obstacles that we have yet to overcome. Vinita.
Vinita, I think you're going to unmute.
Sorry, as I said in my short introduction, I strongly believe that the solutions have to come from bottom up. And I quite like what Ravi was saying about this whole idea of joint stewardship. This is not to say that top-down solutions have not worked, but my worry is that the alignment between what you, in terms of the SDGs and the climate targets, will not be met if you have what seems to be primarily technocratic driven solutions. And the reason I say this, as I said, is because of past history, past experience, the fact that we are not also confronting politics or power relations. That's the hidden elephant in the room. And we've talked about, I've talked about capitalism, but it's very interesting from the perspective where I am from, both local and global solutions need to sort of coordinate. Much of the bauxite in the region that I'm looking at is going to the military industrial complex in the West. But this is not to say that top-down solutions don't work. Our Montreal moment in 1987, where we were able to tackle CFCs, were able to get together, that was a very positive outcome. So how do we get a sort of good Anthropocene to emerge from where we are at now, especially as I see COVID having resulted in much more draconian top-down solutions and top-down governance. So democratizing governance, democratizing, understanding these feedback loops is going to be very important. And also just to point out that the recent Nature article talks about the way in which much of the research now, the LDCs are researching more on climate change related issues than journals and research in the north, and that's came as quite a surprise to me. So issues such as biofuels, biomass, crops resilient to climate change is now being researched on in these countries. So those are where the solutions are going to come from. So science has to align with what Ravi has called the solutions for the global south. And if research is going to follow that way, I'm surprised that this is the case. So I think rethinking with solutions that come out from rural areas, that come out from forest-based communities, from people's sort of action, and thinking about multiple ways of living and being on this planet is for me going to be the way forward. And I don't see very much evidence of that.
We're going to come to the way forward in a few moments. We're still kind of standing in 2030, if we can, thinking about some of these obstacles, but also some of these positives that we have helped bring about some shift along the way. Val?
Well, I would agree with quite a lot of Vinita's obstacles, but I think one of the things that has made a change, and we're seeing this already, is just vastly heightened awareness of what's at stake and collective sense of urgency. And I think there are lots of things that we can attribute that to, including growing youth voice, actually empowerment of some groups to have a stronger voice in a lot of our discussions. I think we also need to credit some of what's going on, and this is a double-edged sword, but some of what's going on in the private and financial sector in terms of recognizing risk and the importance of risk in those nasty, horrible capitalist terms. That's actually driving quite a lot of change. And things like disclosing climate risk and now increasingly disclosing nature-related risk for investment is going to change the way some of those really quite big and very top-down economically driven decisions are made. And I think that, for me, is one of the things that it all stems from improved understanding and recognition and awareness. And I can come back to some really nitty-gritty mechanistic things. But I think that broadened understanding, awareness, and sense of urgency can take credit for some of the change we've seen by 2030.
Thank you. Francisco.
Yeah. Well, I agree with what has been said before. I'm not going to say it again. I'm just going to say that, well, sadly, I think one of the drivers, positive drivers, is a negative one. The thing that we're realizing that the climate is probably moving to a different state. It's not going to go back, even if we do all the mitigation we want. It's not going to go back. So this is in a sense good, that we're realizing this, because we are finally putting in developing countries, we're putting more attention to adaptation than mitigation. Governments are strangely focused on only mitigation. This is what happens, at least here in Mexico. And well, and this implies different things. Sometimes in economics of climate change, if you look at the projections and all of this, we see that, well, countries that are in low latitudes are going to have the worst impacts. Developing countries are going to have the worst impacts, not the global north. But I think we are going to learn that models are kind of conservative. The projections are not really so realistic. So we have some kind of surprises still in the box. And what we have seen, for example, in recent times is that this is happening, like extreme events that wouldn't have occurred in normal climate are occurring now. On the other side, we have seen, as Vinita said, now that there are in the past some examples of intervention with the climate system that really helped. For example, the Montreal Protocol, that really helped driving down for a little while the rate of growth in global temperatures. What is sometimes referred by the skeptics as the hiatus or the pause in warming. No? But the thing is that, yeah, we can control this. We don't have to wait 50 years to see the results of mitigation. No? But we are late. No? We are very late on acting. Climate is already has already changed, and we are going to go from the change that we brought about. We're going to see what happens when we bring another change towards I don't know, the 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees goal.
I'll stop you there. Thank you, Ravi.
Well, thanks, John. Thinking back from where I am today in 2030 to what was making the difference, you know, I completely agree with Francisco that you know, people started understanding that the overemphasis on mitigation was the pipe dream of a do-over. We could just remove all the bad stuff and suddenly life could go back. And people started realizing this is what's happening. We have to adapt to it, and people started adapting. Now, in that process, people understood, and you know, Scott perhaps described it best when he talked about seeing like a state, and his description of high modernism. That the problem of governments and large bodies was that they could not distinguish between the you know, the immense number of contexts that needed to be adapted to. So what started was a process of innovation, where farmers' knowledge, the kinds of people that Vinita is describing in India or any traditional society, their knowledge of their particular context was given credibility. So we started seeing bespoke solutions emerging. And these solutions emerged better and were more resilient where social capital was either strong, intact, or had been rebuilt. So we saw a conjunction between natural capital and social capital, and resilience and adaptive capacity that had been missed for a long time. Because the assumption was all we need was a large sum of money and we could throw it at the problem and the problem would go away. And primarily that was being thrown at the mitigation side because adaptation was proving to be very difficult, because adaptation requires bespoke solutions and innovation. And if you are a state, you are not looking for innovation amongst your people, because that means a dilution of your power. India had in 2021, and it soon disappeared. And now I'm crossing my fingers, it actually did disappear, a one district, one crop policy, which is to me, you know, equivalent of taking a gun and shooting yourself. What started emerging very clearly, along with the idea that natural capital and social capital were entwined, was the need to step away from toxic masculinity in politics. And this basically has pervaded everything. The whole concept that agriculture was simply the Industrial Revolution applied to the land was fueled by the idea that that you could control nature in ways that nature didn't allow itself to be controlled. Rather than living with nature, which is the more feminine approach, the masculine approach was to dominate nature. And this led to the paradigm of optimization, of looking at yield rather than land equivalence, and the assumption that it was an optimization on a piece of land where a soil was substrate and everything, inputs could be provided, and there was a massive sink into which all the junk could be thrown. So we started understanding that this was much more complex, humility was much more important, and we started looking at ecosystems and social systems as being intricately entwined. And really, it was the pandemic and the numbers of variants that suddenly, you know, people realized that nature has a way of dealing with things, that we are not the masters of nature. So these were some of the insights that drove the kinds of changes despite best efforts from some governments and recalcitrance from others.
Thank you very much for that. All very cogent and insightful points. I'm now going to bring you back to the present very briefly here, because we're running short of time, but some final reflections thinking about the where we go from here, about what particular pathways we should be looking to broaden out and open up that might support that alignment, that acceleration to achieve those twin agendas and other related agendas. You know, are we looking at opportunities for real change and larger scale transformation? And if so, how do we move forward? Just a few minutes each, if we could, starting with Vinita.
So, I appreciate what Valerie said about this change that we assume has taken place. But again, as a historian, I've seen this change before. The declensionist arguments again of the British when they're talking about the drying up of Africa, in the late 19th century and so on, and putting into place solutions. So where are we? I mean, the knowledge is not enough. How are we implementing it? Boris Johnson, on one hand, is saying, yes, he wants to do this. On the other hand, he's okaying, hundreds of miles more of roads. He's okaying, he's limited the green tax. He's not taxing airports anymore. So there's a whole range of other activities. He's just given sanction to Britain's first coal mine in a long time. So, where is the action? So looking at it today, certainly from a British perspective, is not really hopeful. So is this going to lead towards? And the other point that Francesco talked about, adaptation. I'm worried that the whole language of adaptation might lead to zones of exception, which would be areas which are left, 50 million people from Bangladesh and South Asia might migrate if those cities sink under, by 2030 or 2040 under climate change. Where are they going to migrate? Well, that is what someone like Amitabh Ghosh would call the sacrificial zone. You can sacrifice those people. So in some, and again, the Adivasis of Eastern India are zones of exception in Algamens terms, to be sacrificed for the interests of resource extraction, which will continue. So unless we confront the political issues and see and confront that, no positive local solutions are going to come about, which will change things on the ground. Because otherwise it's going to be business as usual. It will be business as usual because corporate companies don't see anything beyond their immediate profits. So, the last point I want to say is that popular action seems to have increased even from 2019 to now, 70%, right? So we're going to see a world riddled with conflict. We're going to see more policing. We're going to see more surveillance. We're going to see more ghettoization.
That's quite heavy. I'd say that the glass was looking certainly half full or half empty or less from that perspective. Val?
I was about to say, now I'm depressed. But I do think there are some glimmers of hope even within those structures that we worry about. And I completely agree about political swings. Having spent a lot of time working in Brazil on deforestation, we've seen that reverse itself at least twice, the most recently being the most shocking. But there is something that I think is changing, which is that addressing this is becoming a function or addressing at least some of these challenges is becoming a form of enlightened self-interest for some of those big economic actors. And we're seeing this in some of the business community. And you can call it an adaptation action, and I do in some contexts, and in other times, and actually sometimes if you use that language, people just look really mystified. But there is something about economic resilience, which isn't just about profit, or if it is, it's about recognizing what continued profit depends on, and some of that is about getting this stuff right. And I think we are increasingly seeing some recognition of that, and it could go completely the other way. I agree, but that's the glimmer that I'm holding on to, because we are seeing some fairly good evidence of at least a few role models, if you like, where some of these things that we have in the past framed either as challenges, well, most recently as challenges, previously as social responsibility or social and environmental responsibility, are becoming a matter of enlightened self-interest because they have to. And I think that's where some of the hope comes from.
Thank you. Over to Francisco.
Yeah, well, one of the things that that I think are very important to really change the path we're in is to make a simple change. It looks kind of simple, no? Climate change and SDGs are trending topics in social media. No, we have to make these trending topics in real life, no? And really followed by action. That would be the most transformative. Either from bottom up or top down, this has to happen, or both at the same time. And I think one of the lessons of COVID, I'm going to do it again, is that we realize that science, education, and technology are really important, no? And not only being developed in the global north. This is for the good health of the world. This has to happen everywhere, no? So this is linked to my following point, that it would seem to some of you that John didn't took me back to 2020. He took me to 1990 or something like this, no? Because I think we really need to start thinking about what we really know about the climate system, what we really know, how are these responses going to happen? Because we really don't know that much, no? I think, for example, what has been happening the last few weeks with all these floodings and extreme temperatures, we are realizing that there is something that we're not completely getting, no? Or at least we have this hint, no? Look in that direction. And I think the same happens with, I can see this, for example, in Mexico, no? We're having actions to adapt. But then you realize that, okay, what are we adapting to? What are the risks? Do we know what is going to happen in this little municipality in the middle of nowhere? No, we don't, no, but we are adapting. So this has to change. We have to learn more about our societies. We have to learn more about the communities, knowledge they have, the response we can implement, and we have to learn more about the risks and the tipping points and thresholds that we might go through. No, that would be that would put us in a different path towards 2030 and the end of this century.
Thank you very much. Over to Ravi.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it was Val who said this. It just depends which side of the bed you get off from, you know, whether you look at it. But just looking ahead, I think, to me, you know, Joe started the day by talking about power, and I think we've all talked about power in one sense of the you know, the more distributed it is, the better chances we've got, but, you know, the slower progress might be. A benign dictator, everybody's, frankly, everybody's wet dream in India, who would sort of reach you to, you know, salvation is sort of the dangerous counterpoint to where I think when, you know, people are allowed to have agency and innovate. So how do we move forward? 2 or 3 quick examples here. I think where you have social capital, innovation, and natural capital coming together, bet on that, bet heavily on that. I'm seeing that emerging across the natural farming. Within 4 years in Andhra Pradesh, they have gone from 0 farmers practicing natural farming practically to 700,000, and the aim is to get to 6 million. What started as, you know, frankly, in some senses a little bit flaky, has suddenly become, you know, driven by local innovation, by science, and by need, and is picking up momentum right across the country. The same happened in Niger with farmer managed natural regeneration. The same happened with the dairy revolution in Kenya, when, you know, people started picking up on this. Agroecology across Latin America was a similar thing. So where people come together and there is social capital and it's betting on natural capital, and there is innovation, bet heavily on that. I don't believe that, you know, that there are many examples, there may be a few, of somebody going to a drawing board and coming up with a brilliant plan and saying, this is the plan for the future. If you look at the best investments of the Green Climate Fund, they are there where there's already been momentum. This is the same with the GEF. It is almost the same with everything else. So I really believe that practice must lead policy, but the idea is to find that practice. And that is, I think, the fundamental role of science and the kind of science that we're discussing here. Analyze and understand where are those leverage points, where are the tipping points, and to direct investment and action there. If we leave, if the connection between science, evidence, and action remains as loose and as long as it is, then trial and error learning is just going to be too slow. We have to speed up learning. And that is the one thing that I would say here. If all of you, and I've heard some really great talks today, but we cannot be paralyzed by analysis. We have to understand as scientists that we are part of this world, and it is incumbent on us to take action. There are no such thing as neutral observers. You are not a neutral observer on a Titanic that's sinking. You are just one more person going to meet your maker under an iceberg.
Well, on that fascinating metaphor and set of brilliant observations, and I think that last point, Ravi, that you were making about the role of science today and the role that we as a community of practice need to play to contribute that evidence for action, that really is the essence of what the symposium was about, and I think is a great way to wrap this up. And it's on that note, I'd like to thank our 4 panelists for your rising to the challenge of this thought experiment and contributing your views, your ideas, both looking backward and looking forward. And I'd like to hand over now to Director Joseph Alcamo, the Director of Sussex Sustainability Research Program, to close out our symposium. Thank you all very much.
No, John, I think that's a little unfair. I'd rather not have that you end this particular session, because I was just really getting into it, I have to say. But I'm going to cheat just a bit, because I'm going to just I'm going to claim special rights because of my age, that I've been around for a few years, watching all this stuff for a few years, and I was making a list of why I'm still optimistic. Okay, so let me just share that with you. First of all, in the years that I have been working on this kind of stuff, the acceptance of renewable energy has gone through the roof. There's been the mainstreaming of sustainable agriculture. There's been the assumption at the UN that action has to be local, though they haven't acted on that yet. I admit it, and the funding isn't there yet. But there's universal acceptance that it has to be local. And it wasn't that way 10 years ago. You can ask Ravi. Universities are competing with each other to incorporate sustainability in the curricula. They want to be the most sustainable university, and they have to prove it. Environmental and climate justice is a snowballing movement in scholarship and in action. There's all kinds of funding for the ideas of innovation and experimentation that I've never experienced before, I have to say. And I have literally chased funds for decades, and I have not seen the accent on innovation and experimentation. That, for me, is a very good sign. So with those and others, I'm going to stick with it for a while, and that's what I'm impressed about all of you folks also, even given the fact that we realize what the situation is. I think everybody's planning to stick with it, and I admire you for that. Anyway, all I have is rather pragmatic things to say now, since this was kind of a wrap-up session already. So I'm just going to give you some idea about our follow-up, very pragmatic things, like most of the slides from the presentations will be made available on the SSRP website soon. Videos of the plenaries will also be available, including this plenary session. We will, that is, the University of Sussex will put out a summary report on this symposium in about 2 months' time. We're aiming for the beginning of October. What's perhaps more of interest to you, that this was, in a way, a preparatory or a meeting to discuss issues that were very relevant for COP26. And we, then again, the University of Sussex, will literally draw on the insights from the past 3 days and add them to a report that we happen to be preparing for the UK Parliament, which is targeted towards COP26 delegates, that with the theme being aligning the climate and SDG agendas. So all of the great wisdom that's been generated in this session and previous sessions, we're going to try and work as much of that material as possible in a report, which we think will have some impact since the UK is the host this year, and it will be a report from the Parliament to the COP26 delegates. It won't be the only one, but it will be one of them. I should say that over the past 3 days, it's been this new model of online symposium, which we've all been doing, right, for the last year or going on a year and a half, unbelievably enough. So participants pick and choose. I don't think anyone has joined us on the first day and stuck with us all the way through. So we're guessing that most participants have participated in maybe 2 or 3 sessions. So we only have a rough estimate of number of participants. We're estimating somewhere between 250 and 375 all told that have joined one session or another over the course of the last 3 days. And at the same time, we have had registrations from 71 countries, which have made this nice map of where our participants have come from. So at least I'm quite pleased to see that UK is maybe slightly larger than India and Mexico and Germany, but a lot of participation from Ghana, South Africa, and many other countries around the world. A total of 71 countries, or participants from 71 countries, have registered for this. And then if I can continue quickly. So with regards to the highlights, I was trying to convince myself not to point out any of them because I don't want to get into it. There's so many interesting things that were said, but one stream was that there were a lot of examples that were presented of things happening on the ground where the climate and SDG agendas are being linked. In South Africa, we heard some research that linked drought with poverty and the capacity to cope with HIV in South Africa. From Papua New Guinea, we heard about a program, a public health program that also advanced the conservation of tropical forests and carbon sequestration. From the government of Ghana, we heard this morning from the executive director of their Environmental Protection Agency about their integrated approach towards climate protection and achieving SDGs. Now, of course, the big question is how are we going to scale up these individual examples, and what about other examples that exist out there? I'll just leave that hanging and move on to another key conclusion. Had to do with a group of speakers when we kicked off on day 1, who were conveying the urgency of a rapid transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy in the context of net zero in 2050. What was interesting is that in some sessions afterwards, there were some speakers that said, hold on, 2050 is not going to be adequate, that if we want to stay within 1.5 degrees, it has to be 2030. Now, okay, so that opens up a debate about, has climate adaptation efforts factored in that scientific reality, that if we don't make it by 2030 with net zero, it's likely that we will be in the zone between 1.5 and 2 degrees. An interesting conclusion. But then interestingly enough, other speakers questioned the net zero and 2050 goal, pointing out someone had done a scenario analysis of the economic connections between that and the net zero goal, and pointed out they expected large job losses in India if the net zero target was reached. And another speaker pointed out that the phasing out of fossil fuel is going to have a very interesting, I don't know if that was the word she used, but certainly worth looking at impact on pension funds and philanthropies and other elephants in the room that we haven't quite looked at. And that's what I think, this kind of discourse between researchers when they come to this kind of platform that we've that we've provided over the last 3 days is really essential to finding solutions. You proceed along under certain assumptions that this solution is going to work, and someone comes in and says, wait a minute. Not that you should be knocked off course, just that you should incorporate all the information you need to make the solutions work. At least that's what I draw from this kind of discourse as exhibited about the debate about the net zero in 2050 goal. One of the main conclusions of our discussions over the last 3 days, I'm sure you noticed, was this prospective power shift that's either was certainly happening around the world. The question is how comprehensive it is, and that is namely from the global driving local, switching to local driving global with regards to climate adaptation efforts, with regards to some SDGs. Well, examples were presented from Philippines, from Indonesia, from Europe, from many different countries around the world. But some speakers said, hold on, do the local communities have the capacity and knowledge to take leadership in local climate adaptation? Which led to a discussion at some sessions about the role of national governments. That was in the light of this, this shift in power, perhaps, that's going on around the world, from global to local to global, local driving global. What is going to be the role of national governments in all of this? Are they going to be a funnel for international funds for local climate adaptation, locally led climate adaptation? Will they insist on local accountability? Will they perhaps coordinate education for the local communities so that they do have the knowledge and capacity to lead the charge in climate adaptation? All great questions which we will review, and all of these findings and others we'll review in our summary report, which will be available in about 2 months. So now I want to move on to thanking all of the people responsible for this great symposium. First of all, the plenary and parallel session chairs, the presenters and panel members. Hold on here. I want to thank all of the keynote speakers from all over the world that contributed their insights to our symposium. I want to thank our great 10 co-hosts that also contributed so much to organizing the symposium and getting the word out about it. And I want to thank all of the presenters and the panel members. And I want to especially thank the main organizers of the event, Amy Sweet, John Thompson, Fiona Hurd, and especially Carlos Mire Fernandez, who stepped in and been our main organizer of this great event, as well as all of the technical facilitators and note takers who have been engaged over the past 3 days. Most of all, I want to thank all of you for participating, for contributing your insights. Please stay well, and please compiling evidence for action, and then please act. Thank you very much for everything, and see you again soon, I hope.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay, Fernand.